Welcome, my fellow thinkers and dreamers. This is Mind Palace Musings, and I am your host, David Wellman. In the past two episodes, we discussed consciousness and whether it was a product of the brain or something that the brain acted as a receptor for. In this episode, I'm going to turn all that on its head and posit that there may be no brain, that everything is generated by consciousness. Now, that is a lofty statement to start an episode with, but I promise I will get more into it. That being said, it is a lofty topic, and it's not something I can adequately cover in a short, roughly 20-minute episode, so it's definitely something that I would like to explore in the future in, albeit more drilled down detail. So, just before we get started, consciousness can be defined as awareness or sentience of internal or external existence. I promise that is the last time I will read that out, because this is going to be the last episode in this given series about consciousness. I'm going to do something different next time. Anyway, consciousness has been studied and pondered for millennia by scholars and scientists and artists and poets and philosophers alike, and we are still no closer to an answer these thousands of years later. Now, going back to there being no brain, I'm sure many of you have met and experienced people who seemingly do not have brains, and some are even elected into positions of power. It's the most bizarre thing. In any case, let's dive right into the topic of the brain is generated by consciousness. To start this episode, we're going to make a few assumptions. The first assumption is that the world that we are currently experiencing is either a simulation or a dream. Despite how real it feels, it's not real in the sense of it actually being real, which I will get to later in the episode. We may be an infinite amount of layers deep in the simulation, like the movie Inception, and the simulation is not necessarily running on a computer, nor is it necessarily running on mechanical hardware. For all intents and purposes, the brain doesn't have any relation to consciousness, but it must appear so to make the simulation more convincing to us. So what is real, really? Reality is defined as the state or quality of having existence or substance, which doesn't really say much, though I suppose it's not every day that you are asked to define reality. Reality seems like one of those things that shouldn't need definitions or explanations. We're all here experiencing it right now. Or are we? So there's a concept known as consensus reality. The concept that reality is only real because we've all agreed it to be real. It, in theory, is no less real than our dreams or the realm or the state in which we experience our dreams. But because it is the most stable and the most concrete to us, it is easy for everyone to agree that this is reality. If we look at reality from a material standpoint, we could also argue that it's all just energy at a certain vibration, and that we simply exist and can experience it at this level of vibration, though that starts to go into quantum theory, and I am not equipped to explain any of that. So, moving on. Some Buddhist beliefs posit that life is a dream, and that reality is no realer than our dreams, and our dreams are no less real than reality. They have a concept called bardos, which are transitionary periods, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but I'll try at my best. We are currently in what's called the Kaine bardo, which is the period between birth and death. The point at death is which the mind stream withdraws from the physical body, which I kind of described in my first episode of the brain being a receiver of consciousness. There's 5 other bardos, and Buddhism also has a concept of 8 different consciousnesses. It's pretty interesting. Not something I'm going to go into this episode, but maybe something I will get into in a future one. So now that we've considered that potentially nothing is real, let's start talking about simulation theory. I'm sure you've heard of this one. It's been floating around for at least a decade now, probably further back than that. But the theory goes that we could be living in a very compelling simulation. Now, what do we mean by simulation? Well, that could actually mean a lot. We could go by the traditional computer simulation model, but I like to explore more than just that. I feel like that's a bit limiting. So, in one hand, we could be the simulations of a sufficiently advanced intellectual species, much like our own, perhaps, much different, perhaps. That's how you speak. They could be very different, they could be similar to us, but in any case, our entire universe could be running on a supercomputer right now. Hell, maybe the society is so advanced that we're running on some consumer-grade hardware. I could spend ages going into the implications of that. But as discussed in previous episodes, our brains are essentially biological computers. This simulated universe could be running on something that isn't made out of silicon and metal. It could be biological, it could be chemical, it could even be a storm of free electrons where each spark is a new universe simulation. I just don't want the idea of the simulation to be so rigidly stuck on it being in a computer. Now, the simulation doesn't necessarily have to be coming from outside either. It could be coming from inside and generating out. Our consciousness could act as the point of simulation where everything we experience is being simulated by our consciousness and projected outwards. The energy we put out has the potential to change the simulation. The collective human consciousness, our fears and our hopes could all influence everything around us and not the other way around. Now, if this is a simulation, the more terrifying idea is that we could be alone in it. We could be the only entity at this point being simulated, and everything else could just be a shallow copy that is made to look like another entity in the simulation. Now, this is an idea that I call the consciousness paradox, and maybe it's been explored under a different name, and I'll definitely explore it either in a future episode or a blog post or something like that. But we can drill down further. It's possible that the only thing that's ever been simulated is this very moment in time, and that everything leading up to it is just pre-populated data, which I think some people also call last Thursdayism, which is another concept we can explore. Essentially, there's no proof that the universe didn't just start last Thursday and that all our memories of everything before last Thursday are false. We have no way to test it, but that is kind of the nature of this episode. It's very what if and not very much here is evidence for the following. So we must ask why. Why would we want to simulate existence? Well, if you think about the human brain, which I did say at the start of this episode doesn't exist, but bear with me, we as humans crave novelty. When you're a kid, everything just has this sense of wonder and joy, and time is just so slow to you because everything is new and fresh. And it's the same as you grow up. When you are living in a new experience, even if you, let's say, watch a YouTube video, the first time you watch it will feel a lot longer than the second or third time. You can go and test that now. Go watch a new video, something short, something 15 seconds. Watch it the first time, then watch it again and again. It'll get faster every time, and that's because our brains are craving novelty. Now, what is the best way to experience novelty if not to create this simulation in which you experience everything there is to experience? That means you get to experience every single piece of novelty there ever is in this given existence, sorry. Which I just think is crazy. We could be this is universe MX1C, and you can gain the following experiences from it, and this could just be some novel experience that is vended out to who knows what or who. It could also potentially exist to study why we exist, which is a weird thing to say. But essentially, imagine an immortal consciousness that exists but does not know why it exists, and perhaps even lacks the facilities to explore why it exists. Then surely it makes sense to create some simulated universe in which it can experience beings that can question why it exists. It's at this point that humans must go beyond asking, who am I? And rather ask, what am I? Going a bit more on the spiritual side, or maybe just the idea of the immortal consciousness as explored in the first episode, you could look at the simulation as a library of personalities where an immortal consciousness can pick and choose experiences that it wants before being born into this realm. It may be the case that whatever realm our consciousness resides in normally is, let's say, of such love and happiness and understanding and light and joy that there's just no room to learn. It's very typical that we learn from failure and not from constant success and praise. Sometimes you need to feel pain and to suffer to learn valuable lessons, and to subtly improve yourself over however many iterations. It makes more sense to do it in a material realm in which there's entropy and pain and suffering and malice, yet love is still such an important force between it all. This also potentially means that everything that will happen has already happened, and that we are simply witnessing it happen, which then brings free will into the question, which is something I'll discuss in a future episode, maybe even the next episode. As mentioned earlier, we may be alone in the simulation. We could be a very lonely god, to put it loosely. Even outside of the simulation, we might just be the one consciousness. And if we are lonely, then perhaps every other human in the simulation is actually conscious. And it's just that splitting of the consciousness that we use to stave off the inordinate loneliness of being the only thing in existence, which sounds quite terrifying. This whole concept of coming to Earth might be put into question if we are an immortal consciousness residing outside of it. You might ask, why would we come here to suffer? As mentioned earlier, there's the learning aspect, the experiencing aspect. Maybe we want to see this grand story told from many different angles, but it also ties into a concept I call the self-perfecting spiral. The idea that we might be coming to this existence as many times as is required to slowly perfect the immortal soul or consciousness, which is not my own unique concept. It's also a motif in many major religions, but it is one I've come to independently through methods I'll talk about in a future episode about the self-perfecting spiral itself. We, of course, can't get into a topic that is this out there without talking about drugs. Psychedelics specifically. There's another theory that life could be a bad trip. Maybe not a bad trip, just a trip in general. So, for those that haven't used, and for those that have, I suppose, when you take a psychedelic, it alters your sense of being, it alters your thought patterns, it alters how you experience the world. It puts you in this euphoric state where everything is nostalgic and novel. It's like you're a kid again. Now, take a heavy enough dose and you'll probably forget that you're tripping at all. And what I mean by that is it's going to put you in such a state that, for all intents and purposes, you're in a different reality. This is especially common and measurable on the very powerful psychedelic DMT, whether it is smoked or taken more ritualistically as ayahuasca. Users report that their soul has been ripped from their body and thrown through hyperspace. They will find themselves in a new reality that is very commonly described as realer than reality. Or the user may simply feel that they've died and that this is their new reality. It's very common for DMT users to describe experiences where they've met entities, and these entities are kind of common between users, which is pretty crazy to think. Now, this is a substance that deserves a lot of respect, firstly, but an episode, even a series by itself. But people who use DMT can agree that it feels like you're breaking out of the matrix. Like, this current life that we are living this isn't real. And when you break out, it feels like a completely different ballgame. I've already talked about drugs, religion, and spirituality in this episode. Let's add another mark to Taboo Bingo and talk about death. So let's go a bit more out there. Life as we know it right now might be us reliving our entire life in our final moments as our life is flashing before our eyes. As I speak, we could be dead. Maybe me, maybe you, I don't know. But what we are currently experiencing might just be the life that we lived replaying itself. Or it might be like Inception, the movie, where each time we die, our brain is simply throwing us into a new simulation to live a new life. It's us clinging on for dear life. Maybe that's not the right way to phrase it. But it's our consciousness clinging on before it is reduced to nothing, and that would go back to a consciousness that is generated by a biological brain and not the other way around. This could happen any infinite number of times until there's just no more time or energy left for our first original body to keep going on. And this is not just the heat death of the universe, but the heat death of existence. This is somewhat of a fractal, if you think about it. Fractals being very common in nature, a lot more common than you'd think. I think fractals are quite interesting as these infinitely zooming mathematical patterns that, who knows, may or may not be subtle winks, or maybe not so subtle winks, that maybe we should take this reality a bit less seriously because it might not be real. Everything I've discussed in this episode obviously brings some implications to light. It means that you should enjoy your life because for all you know, you might already be dead. Meditation and psychedelic substance experiences may tell you more about yourself than you could have ever imagined. Subtle patterns that you notice in your life and going on in the world may be less coincidental than you think. Each cycle of life may be trying to teach you something, and life may have more meaning than we assign to it. Things are real because we agree that they are, just like money. Just because we can chart something doesn't mean it is real, and the converse is also true that just because we can't chart something down doesn't mean it isn't real. Everything you know could just be recycled fragments of lives you've lived in the past, where the first one was the only real life that you actually lived. And we may be truly alone in the universe, with everyone and everything around us just being simple simulations. Hopefully that last implication didn't put you into a existential spiral or crisis. That wasn't the intention. This episode was a lot more what if, and not that much this is how it is, which I suppose is kind of the point of this entire podcast. It's to ask the questions that beget more questions, rather than ask the questions that you know you'll get an answer to. It's for the endlessly curious, those that wish to seek truth and knowledge, even where we maybe should not be looking. So, in any case, I hope you enjoyed this series on what consciousness might be. I'm not here to tell you what it is. I've simply given you different options, and now it's up to you to decide which one you would like to think is best. So, thank you for listening, my fellow seekers of truth and knowledge. This has been Mind Palace Musings. I have been your host, David Wellman, and if you're enjoying the podcast so far, please do like and rate and comment and whatever else. I don't know what platform you're listening to this on. I'm sure it has some kind of option for that. And this, as I mentioned at the start of the episode, will be the end of this current mini-series on consciousness, and the next episode will do something a bit lighter, a little palate cleanser, if you will. So, until next time, thanks for listening.